The issue of slavery was one that was historically treated with concern by the Catholic Church. Throughout most of human history, slavery has been practiced and accepted by many cultures and religions around the world. Certain passages in the Old Testament sanctioned forms of slavery, and the New Testament taught slaves to obey the masters. After the legalization of Christianity under the Roman Empire, there was a growing sentiment that many kinds of slavery were not compatible with Christian conceptions of charity and justice. Some argued against all forms of slavery, while others, including the influential Thomas Aquinas, argued the case for slavery subject to certain restrictions. The Christian West did succeed in almost entirely enforcing that a free Christian could not be enslaved, for example when a captive in war, but this itself was subject to continual improvement and was not consistently applied throughout history. The Middle Ages also witnessed the emergence of orders of monks such as the Mercedarians, who were founded for the purpose of ransoming Christian slaves. By the end of the medieval period, enslavement of Christians had been largely abolished throughout Europe, although enslavement of non-Christians remained permissible, and had seen a revival in Spain and Portugal. Although some Catholic clergy, religious orders and popes owned slaves, and the naval galleys of the Papal States were to use captured Muslim galley slaves, Roman Catholic teaching began to turn more strongly against unjust forms of slavery in general, beginning in 1435, prohibiting the enslavement of the recently baptized, culminating in pronouncements by Pope Paul III in 1537. However, when the Age of Discovery greatly increased the number of slaves owned by Christians, the response of the Church, under strong political pressures, was confused and ineffective in preventing the establishment of slave societies in the colonies of Catholic countries. Papal bulls such as Dum Diverses, Romanus Pontifex and the derivatives sanctioned slavery and were used to justify enslavement of natives and the appropriation of the lands during this era. The depopulation of the Americas, and consequently the shortage of slaves that came about through diseases allegedly brought over by the Europeans, and the harsh treatment of the native populations, inspired increasing debate during the 16th century over the morality of slavery. The first extensive shipment of black Africans to make good the shortage of native slaves, what would later become known as the Transatlantic slave trade, was initiated at the request of Bishop Las Casas and authorized by Charles V in 1517. Las Casas later rejected all forms of slavery and became famous as the great protector of Indian rights. No papal condemnation of transatlantic slave trade was made at the time. Las Casas in 1547 declared that the Spanish never waged a just war against the Indians since they did not have a just cause for doing so. A number of popes did issue papal bulls condemning unjust enslavement and mistreatment of Native Americans by Spanish and Portuguese colonials. However, these were largely ignored. Nonetheless, Catholic missionaries such as the Jesuits, who also owned slaves, worked to alleviate the suffering of Native American slaves in the New World. Debate about the morality of slavery continued throughout this period, with some books critical of slavery being placed on the Index of Forbidden Books by the Holy Office between 1573 to 1826. Capuchin missionaries were excommunicated for calling for the emancipation of black slaves in the Americas. On the 22nd of December 1741, Benedict XIV promulgated the papal bull Mensa Pastorum Principis against the enslavement of the indigenous peoples of the Americas and other countries. In spite of a stronger condemnation of unjust types of slavery by Pope Gregory XVI in his bull In Supremo Apostolatus issued in 1839, some American bishops continued to support slave-holding interests until the abolition of of slavery. In 1866, the Holy Office of Pope Pius IX affirmed that, subject to conditions, it was not against divine law for a slave to be sold, bought or exchanged. In 1995, Pope John Paul II repeated the condemnation of infamies, including slavery, issued by the Second Vatican Council. 30 years later, taking up the words of the Council and with the same forcefulness I repeat that condemnation in the name of the whole Church, certain that I am interpreting the genuine sentiment of every upright conscience. Catholic teaching. The new Catechism of the Catholic Church, published in 1994, sets out the official position. The seventh commandment forbids acts or enterprises that ... lead to the enslavement of human beings, to the being bought, sold and exchanged like merchandise, in disregard for their personal dignity. It is a sin against the dignity of persons and the fundamental rights to reduce them by violence to the productive value it was a source of profit. St. Paul directed a Christian master to treat his Christian slave no longer as a slave but more than a slave, as a beloved brother. Both in the flesh and in the Lord. Development. Since the Middle Ages, the Christian understanding of slavery has seen significant internal conflict and endured dramatic change. Nearly all Christian leaders before the late 17th century regarded slavery as consistent with Christian theology. Today, nearly all Christians are united in the condemnation of modern slavery as wrong and contrary to God's will. However, there are many who reject the assertion that the Church's teaching regarding slavery has ever changed. Instead, they argue that the Church has always distinguished between just servitude which is deemed acceptable and unjust servitude which is considered wrong. The concept of slavery as private property is condemned by the Church, which classifies it as the stealing of a person's human rights. Definitions. Like secular legal systems, the Church has at different times distinguished between various forms and elements of slavery, often in a highly theoretical way that has been unclear in its practical application. At particular moments there have been different attitudes to the making of slaves or new enslavement, the trafficking and trading of slaves, and the basic ownership of slaves. A distinction was long made between just and unjust slavery, and whether a particular slave was justly or unjustly kept in that condition could depend on his religious status. The Church long accepted the right of a person to sell himself or his children into slavery, which was sometimes fairly common, or to be sentenced to slavery as a criminal punishment. In addition, slavery was long regarded as essentially an issue of secular law. In discussions of church teaching, slavery is defined by some Catholic writers as the condition of involuntary servitude in which a human being is regarded as no more than the property of another, as being without basic human rights, in other words, as a thing rather than a person. This form of slavery can be called chattel slavery. Quote, they contrast this with just servitude, in which a metaphysical distinction is made between owning a person as an object, and only owning the work of that person. In practical terms, a person could be bought, sold, or exchanged as a form of just servitude, subject to certain conditions. Slavery for debt was typically legally a different matter under both pre-Christian and Christian legal systems. It might be only for a period, and the owner typically did not have the right to sell the slave without his agreement, and had other restrictions. It often was more a form of indentured labor. Ancient legal systems included those of the Israelites seen in the Hebrew Bible, also typically distinguished between native and foreign slaves, with much better protection for the former. This distinction was transferred to Christian versus non-Christian slaves, sometimes with a component of origin as well, for example in Anglo-Saxon laws, but remained very important in Christian thinking and legal legal systems, in particular for the making of new slaves. Under pure chattel slavery, the slave ceases to be a legal person and so has no rights as a person. Historically, such slaves tended to be involved in large-scale industrial or agricultural work. They cannot legally marry and may be sold away from their home and relatives. This is the kind of slavery that existed under Roman law and in the antebellum southern United States. The Christian Church very early treated slaves as persons, and they were allowed to be baptized, marry, and also be ordained. This tended to be reflected in slavery laws of Catholic countries, so that French slaves, for example, were allowed to marry slaves of free people, though neither baptism nor marrying a free person emancipated them, an issue in the leading French legal case of Jean Boët, a Catholic layman reviewing the moral arguments that underpinned the common church teaching and definitions relating to just slavery, wrote in 1861, "They teach concerning slavery what was taught yesterday and the day before, but what no priest or layman believes any longer today. They teach that slavery is not unlawful, firstly, when it proceeds from a legitimate war or voluntary sale, secondly, provided it respects the soul, body, family, and instruction of the slave. But I challenge anyone to show me today, throughout all Christianity, a single slave who has become such as a prisoner of war or through voluntary sale, to say nothing of the manner in which he is treated." Quote, in 1530, the first judges in Audiencia of New Spain contrasted the servitude as practiced in Christian Europe with that of the Indians in a letter to Bruno Mars v. They treat slaves as relations, while the Christians treat them as dogs. Slavery in the New Testament. According to Cardinal Avery Dulles, Jesus, though he repeatedly denounced sin as a kind of moral slavery, said not a word against slavery as a social institution. In several Pauline epistles, and the first epistle of Peter, slaves are admonished to obey the masters as to the Lord, and not to men. However, masters were told to serve the slaves in the same way, and even better, as brothers, to not threaten them, as God is the master as well. Slaves who are treated wrongly and unjustly are likened to the wrongs that Christ unjustly suffered, and masters are told that God shows no favoritism, and that anyone who does wrong will be repaid for his wrong. The Epistle to Philemon has become an important text in regard to slavery. It was used by pro-slavery advocates as well as by abolitionists. In the epistle, Paul writes that he is returning Onesimus, a fugitive slave, back to his master Philemon. However, Paul also entreats Philemon to regard Onesimus as a beloved brother in Christ, rather than as a slave. Cardinal Dulles points out that, while discreetly suggesting that he manumit Onesimus, does not say that Philemon is morally obliged to free Onesimus and any other slaves he may have had. According to tradition, Philemon did free Onesimus, and both were eventually recognized as saints by the Church. David Kirk asserts that, given that the Church received Philemon as inspired scripture, Paul's ambiguity effectively blocked the early fathers of the Church from denouncing slavery outright. As an example, Kirk points out that John Chrysostom, in his sermon on Philemon, considers Paul's sending Onesimus back to his master a sign that slavery should not be abolished. However, in his homilies on Philemon, Chrysostom actually opposes unfair and unjust forms of slavery by stating that those who own slaves are to passionately love the slaves with the very love of Christ for humanity. This is the glory of a master, to have grateful slaves, and this is the glory of a master, that he should thus love his slaves. Let us therefore be stricken with awe at this great love of Christ. Let us be inflamed with this love passion. Though a man be low and mean, yet if we hear that he loves us, we are above all things warmed with love towards him, and honor him exceedingly. And are we then love? And when our Master loves us so much, we are not excited. In the first epistle to Timothy, slave traders are condemned and listed among the sinful and lawbreakers. The first epistle to the Corinthians describes lawfully obtained manumission as the ideal for slaves. Early Christianity encouraged kindness towards slaves. The rape of slaves, considered entirely normal in most preceding systems, was naturally prohibited under the general very strict ban on sex outside marriage in any circumstances, though the effectiveness of the ban of this naturally varied. Christianity recognized marriage of sorts among slaves. Freeing slaves was regarded as an act of charity, and when slaves were buried in Christian cemeteries, the grave seldom included any indication that the person buried had been a slave. In Roman law, slaves were regarded as property, not persons, but this was not the Christian position. Slaves could marry and be ordained as priests. It has been argued that this difference in legal status in the long term undermined the whole position of slavery. Nevertheless, early Christianity rarely criticized the actual institution of slavery. Though the Pentateuch gave protection to fugitive slaves, the Roman Church often condemned with anathema slaves who fled from the masters, and refused them Eucharistic communion. In 340, the Synod of Gangra in Asia Minor condemned certain Manichaeans for a list of 20 practices including forbidding marriage, not eating meat, urging that slaves should liberate themselves, abandoning their families, asceticism and reviling married priests. The later Council of Chalcedon declared that the canons of the Synod of Gangra were ecumenical. Augustine of Hippo, who renounced his former Manichaeanism, opposed unfair and unjust forms of slavery by observing that they originate with human sinfulness, rather than the Creator's original just design of the world, which had initially included the basic equality of all human beings as good creatures, made in God's image and likeness. John Chrysostom described slavery as the fruit of covetousness, of degradation, of savagery, the fruit of sin, of rebellion against our true Father in his homilies on Ephesians. Moreover, quoting partly from Paul the Apostle, Chrysostom opposed unfair and unjust forms of slavery by giving these instructions to those who owned slaves. "And ye masters," he continues, "do the same things unto them." The same things. What are these? "With good will do service, and with fear and trembling toward God, fearing lest he one day accuse you for your negligence toward your slaves, ... and forbear threatening, be not irritating," he means, nor oppressive. The law of the common Lord and Master of all, doing good to all alike, dispensing the same rights to all. Chrysostom, preaching on Acts 4:32-4:33 in a sermon entitled, "Should we not make it a heaven on earth?" stated, "I will not speak of slaves, since at the time there was no such thing, but doubtless such as were slaves they set at liberty." However, St. Patrick, himself a former slave, argued for the abolition of slavery, as had Gregory of Nyssa and Acacius of Amida. Origen favored the Jewish practice of freeing slaves after 7 years. Saint Eligius used his vast wealth to purchase British and Saxon slaves in groups of 50 and 100 in order to set them free. Augustine of Hippo taught that slavery is never a natural condition but one that has arisen as the result of sin. He argued that the institution of slavery derives from God and is beneficial to slaves and masters. However, he also characterized the granting of freedom to slaves as a great virtue. Augustine described slavery and private property not as the creations of God but of sin. Christianity could not save Rome, he wrote, because those with power, including Christian emperors, could not erase the taint of humanity's sin. Augustine asserted that the practice among the Jews of freeing slaves after they had served for 6 years does not apply to the case of Christian slaves, as the Apostle Paul's admonition makes clear. He argued that enslaving captives in war was at least better than killing them, and did not exclude the enslavement by Christians of other Christians in this way, as other Church Fathers had already done. Pope Gregory I. Pope Gregory I, in his Pastoral Care, which remained a popular text for centuries, wrote, "Slaves should be told to despise the masters and recognize they are only slaves." In his commentary on the Book of Job, he wrote that all men are equal by nature, but a hidden dispensation by providence has arranged a hierarchy of merit and rulership, in that differences between classes of men have arisen as a result of sin and are ordained by divine justice. He directed slaves to be employed by the monasteries, as well as forbidding the unrestricted allowance of slaves joining the monastery to escape the servitude. Upon manumitting 2 slaves held by the Church, he wrote, "Since our Redeemer, the Maker of every creature, was pleased mercifully to assume human flesh in order to break the chain of slavery in which we were held captive, and restore us to our pristine liberty, it is right that men, whom nature from the beginning produced free, and whom the law of nations has subjected to the yoke of slavery, should be restored by the benefit of manumission to the liberty in which they were born." However, the Papal Estates alone continued to possess several hundred slaves despite Gregory's lofty rhetoric on the natural liberty of mankind. Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas taught that, although the subjection of one person to another was not part of the primary intention of the natural law, it was appropriate and socially useful in a world impaired by original sin. Aquinas explicitly rejected the notion that slavery is justified by natural law, since he held that all men are equal by nature. For Aquinas, slavery only arises through positive law. Aquinas placed slavery in opposition to natural law, deducing that all rational creatures are entitled to justice. Hence he found no natural basis for the enslavement of one person rather than another, thus removing any possible justification for slavery based on race or religion. Right reason, not coercion, is the moral basis of authority, for one man is not by nature ordained to another as an end. Aquinas defended slavery as instituted by God in punishment for sin, and justified as being part of the right of nations and natural law. He held that slavery could be consistent with natural law if it is imposed by positive law as punishment for crimes, and if such slavery did not violate the slave's rights to food, sleep, marriage, raising of their children, and religious worship. Aquinas asserted that the children of a slave mother were rightly enslaved even though they themselves had not committed personal sin. He further argued that anyone who persuades a slave to escape is guilty of theft, because, while the slave is not himself property, his master has a right to the labor of that slave. Aquinas distinguished 2 forms of subjection or authority, just and unjust. The former exists when leaders work for the advantage and benefit of the subjects. The unjust form of subjection is that of slavery, in which the ruler manages the subject for his own advantage. Quote, St. Thomas Aquinas in mid-13th century accepted the new Aristotelian view of slavery as well as the titles of slave ownership derived from Roman civil law, and attempted, without complete success, to reconcile them with Christian patristic tradition. He takes the patristic theme, that slavery exists as a consequence of original sin, and says that it exists according to the second intention of nature. It would not have existed in the state of original innocence according to the first intention of nature. In this way he can explain the Aristotelian teaching that some people are slaves by nature, like inanimate instruments, because of the personal sins, for since the slave cannot work for his own benefit, slavery is necessarily a punishment. He accepts the symbiotic master-slave relationship as being mutually beneficial. There should be no punishment without some crime, so slavery as a penalty is a matter of positive law. St. Thomas' explanation continued to be expounded at least until the end of the 18th century. B. Jarrett asserts that Aquinas considered slavery as a result of sin and was justifiable for that reason. Aquinas' contemporary, the Franciscan St. Bonaventura, argued on ethical grounds that slavery was infamous and perverting virtue, but accepted its legality. Early Christianity, at least 2 early popes and several other major figures were former slaves, for example Popes Calixtus I, Pius I and Clement I. The Catholic Encyclopedia argues that, in order for the Church to have condemned slavery, it would have had to be willing to incite a revolution that could have resulted in the destruction of all civilization. Primitive Christianity did not attack slavery directly, but it acted as though slavery did not exist. To reproach the Church of the First Ages with not having condemned slavery in principle and with having tolerated it in fact, is to blame it for not having let loose a frightful revolution in which perhaps all civilization would have perished with Roman society. Mark Brumley makes the following points regarding early Christianity and slavery. First, while Paul told slaves to obey the masters, he made no general defense of slavery, any more than he made a general defense of the pagan government of Rome, which Christians were also instructed to obey despite its injustices. He seems simply to have regarded slavery as an intractable part of the social order, an order that he may well have thought would pass away shortly. Second, Paul told masters to treat the slaves justly and kindly, implying that slaves are not mere property for masters to do with as they please. Third, Paul implied that the brotherhood shared by Christians is ultimately incompatible with chattel slavery. In the case of the runaway slave Onesimus, Paul wrote to Philemon, the slave's master, instructing him to receive Onesimus back, no longer as a slave but more than a slave, a brother. With respect to salvation in Christ, Paul insisted that there is neither slave nor free. You are all one in Christ Jesus. Fourth, the Christian principles of charity and the golden rule espoused by the New Testament writers are ultimately incompatible with chattel slavery, even if, because of its deeply established role as a social institution, this point was not clearly understood by all at the time. Fifth, while the Christian empire didn't immediately outlaw slavery, some church fathers strongly denounced it, but then, the state has often failed to enact a just social order in accordance with church teachings. Sixth, some early Christians liberated the slaves, while some churches redeemed slaves using the congregation's common means. Other Christians even sacrificially sold themselves into slavery to emancipate others. Seventh, even where slavery was not altogether repudiated, slaves and freemen had equal access to the sacraments, and many clerics were from slave backgrounds, including 2 popes. This implies a fundamental equality incompatible with slavery. Eighth, the Church ameliorated the harsher aspects of slavery in the empire, even trying to protect slaves by law, until slavery all but disappeared in the West. It was, of course, to re-emerge during the Renaissance, as Europeans encountered Muslim slave traders and the indigenous peoples of the Americas. Manichaean Christians had been inciting slaves of the Roman Empire to emancipate themselves. In response, the Synod of Gangra, now in Turkey, anathematized those who did so. If anyone, on the pretext of religion, teaches another man's slave to despise his master and to withdraw from his service, and not serve his master with good will and all respect, let him be anathema.